Here's why you should sometimes interrupt people when they're talking. Now, a few years back, I came up with this belief that you should never interrupt someone when they're talking because it's impolite. You always let them finish. But I found that in practice, that actually doesn't really work that well. Now, there are some exceptions where you probably shouldn't interrupt someone. Let's say if it's a person A versus person B, one to one interview style podcast. Yeah, you probably shouldn't interrupt them like 95% of the time because then you're going to get a bunch of comments complaining that you're a bad host. I've seen that before, and that's probably what contributed to that belief. Or maybe let's say it's like a one on one date and you're always interrupting. That's another thing where I've seen women complain about it. However, I found that in the corporate world and in personal life, when there's certain, most other situations, especially group dynamics, if you wait for a pause or your turn to talk when someone finishes, it will almost never happen. And they're not doing this intentionally. It's just the fact that in my observations, when they're at the lunch table or a group meeting, men generally like to talk over each other and get their point in and interrupt each other. So when you have multiple men and sometimes women talking over each other, you don't get a chance to speak up unless you interrupt. And then let's say you're saying something important or there's something crucial to that meeting. Uh, if you wait, you're never going to get a chance. And that being said, you can still say it in a respectful, polite way so that when you interrupt, no one's offended. And usually they're not offended as long as you don't do it very harshly or sharply. Because look, sometimes everyone else is already interrupting. Another situation I found that where interrupting is sometimes warranted or needed is when someone is just someone who's not concise. They ramble, they go on, and they continuously repeat a message over and over again in different ways because they're not aware enough to be concise. And therefore, sometimes rather than being quote unquote polite and letting them repeat something where you already get the point for the next 5 minutes, then you just tell them and then we make the meeting more efficient. Now, this has been done to me in the past when I've rambled. And so sometimes you kind of have to sometimes interrupt a bit to break that continuous strain of dialogue to kind of be more efficient politely. I mean, it's probably happened to you before as well, where someone's just going on and on. You've already know all this stuff, but they assume you don't. And that's, really where feedback loops and, politely interrupting comes into play. So those are my tips and stories about this. And I think the big point is that when you get advice or you adopt advice from wherever you learned it, sometimes that advice may seem good on paper, but in the real world, I've just found that, especially with social dynamics, there's a lot more at play. And this advice of never interrupt someone, this blanket statement, just doesn't really work well, especially if you're someone who's more of like an introvert, who is maybe seen more like on the quiet side, who's not really kind of naturally perceived as the person who's domineering or like, you know, the quote unquote alpha in the room or whatever you want to call it. Sometimes you do need to speak up and it is okay to interrupt. Now, of course, you have the other extroverts, the Gary Vaynerchuks in the world who are constantly interrupting and have no problem with it. And while people complain, they're still doing it and they're succeeding. So that's not to say that the answer is to just interrupt people all the time and do it because it's most effective, even when people complain, because there are times when even he is apologizing and saying, I need to interrupt less. So there is a balance there. But I would say sometimes, depending on a situation, especially group dynamics where you have something really important to say, by far it is better to err on the side of interrupting than not. I remember I was recently on a panel podcast with like 8 other guests on at the same time talking. What do you expect I regretted most? It was basically that same thing. Not talking enough and not interrupting enough, Because what ends up happening is you don't really get any major points because there's too many people talking. And then it's like, what's the point of you even being on that podcast if you're too polite to even say something because everyone's talking over each other constantly? So thank you for watching. See you in the next video.